And then once you graduated with your bachelor's, where did you go from there?
So I got interested in severe storms during my my bachelor's work at Wisconsin, and of course the place to go is University of Oklahoma. So I began my master's work in school meteorology here at the University of Oklahoma back in 1987, and my master's work was very much on severe thunderstorms and very short scale, and then I've progressed kind of through my career to longer scale and larger regions, and I've moved into the field of climatology now. So I finished my master's in 1991, and during that year I ended up working with Dr. Ken Crawford, who was on the faculty in the School of Meteorology at the time, on a National Science Foundation grant to bring weather data to classrooms across the state of Oklahoma. And that's the grant that then funded me to start working at the Oklahoma Climatological Survey and with the Oklahoma Mesonet project. And then after several years working there full-time, I decided to go back for my PhD. So I worked part-time on my PhD, also in meteorology, while I worked on the Mesonet and other projects. And so that's where I've been.
So the Mesonet, once you got involved with it, it just kind of created your path forward to some
Yeah,
extent?
so the Mesonet is a very large part of my career. I actually never officially worked for the Oklahoma Mesonet. I was working for the Oklahoma Climatological Survey, and but my husband had been hired on at the Climate Survey several months before me as a software programmer and system administrator. And so, and he worked directly under Dr. Fred Brock as part of the Mesonet, and so Mesonet became part of our lives together. And all of the data, or much of the data that I used in those 3 years that I was working on the National Science Foundation grant was Mesonet data. So spent a lot of time just helping out in various areas with the Mesonet that were a little bit separate from the project that I worked on. But my husband and I tended to work more than 40 hours a week, and so we'd play around with new products and new services that were related to the Mesonet as the Mesonet grew. So I feel like I was one of the people that helped birth the Mesonet.
Did you do in particular programs with children, or describe what it was that you were doing?
So the program that I developed in partnership with a number of other people was a program called EarthStorm. And EarthStorm was to bring Mesonet data into the classroom, so authentic science learning into classrooms across Oklahoma. And the idea was that students would learn science better if they were provided opportunities to kind of learn as they were interested in something. And in Oklahoma, everybody's interested in the weather. And so we would teach various aspects of science, scientific concepts using Oklahoma Mesonet data. And so so we brought in teachers. It was a teacher enhancement program, so we would essentially train the trainers. So we would educate the teachers, and then they would go back to the classroom and have an impact on a much broader community of students than we had time for personally. And we really focused primarily on rural schools, so that at that time in the early 1990s, schools didn't have internet access like they do today. And and especially the rural schools. If there was a phone line that connected to a computer, it was in the principal's office or it was in the library, but teachers didn't have access in their classrooms to that type of technology. And so we provided them all of the education and training, a 3 to 4 week institute during the summer where they would learn about meteorology and the Mesonet and a broad range of learning activities. But they could only participate if their principal signed an agreement that they would provide a phone line in the classroom. So we would provide a computer that they would be able to then access data, and we provided them all of the education and travel stipends and everything, but the school had to buy in some way, and so that was to provide a phone line. So for some of these teachers in very rural areas of Oklahoma, it was their first opportunity to kind of connect to what a lot of the larger schools were starting to. Oklahoma City and Tulsa schools already had connectivity at that time. And so I remember I visited all of these schools. There were some of them that were, it was just a trailer out in somewhere in rural Oklahoma, and we would set up the modem, and at that time it was, if we were lucky, we could get it maybe 7,200 baud and connect in to the University of Oklahoma through what was called a bulletin board system at that time. World Wide Web wasn't up and running. And they could then go through a menu of options and download live data and get that into their classrooms for the kids to use. And so many of those teachers ended up teaching the kids how to go through data download, and so this was the first experience that those students had with accessing data. And we developed software, had a software development team at the Climate Survey, and developed software where they could visualize a cold front moving through or storms coming in. And so over the years it got very, very sophisticated, and to the point that we had a classroom, as an example, we had a classroom in Enid, Oklahoma, at Monroe Elementary. Lori Painter was the teacher, 5th grade or 6th grade, and depending on the year. And her students got connected to the local emergency manager, and at that time it was a volunteer position in emergency management. And so he worked, I think it was at a shoe store, and so he couldn't keep track of the weather during the day. He had a full-time job, and so the students would keep track of the weather, and a certain part of the day they would fax him a map, and they've hand-drawn where the dry line is and where they think that the threat of thunderstorms might be, and he ended up giving them a pager, and so they could page him when storms started breaking out, or if a weather alert came up. And so the students really felt empowered, like they were helping their community. And there were just many, many stories like that. It also empowered a lot of the teachers. So there were teachers from communities that probably wouldn't have had opportunities to really get too involved in national science education projects, but because of their background with EarthStorm and the confidence that they gained, they started applying to some of these national and regional science education projects and became leaders in their communities. So it was a very fulfilling experience. that I had in those 3 years developing that project. So after that, I started overseeing all of our outreach projects that we had at the Oklahoma Climate Survey, and so that started to include outreach for public safety community and a project we called OK First, and then work with the rural electric cooperatives across the state, again for them to better prepare for severe weather during the spring, but mostly for winter storms, which is what most affects the electric utility community. So
EarthStorm was the precursor to OK First?
yeah, we could say EarthStorm was a precursor. We knew we wanted to reach into the public safety community when we started, when the Mesonets started developing, but we also knew that teachers were very, very patient. And so working with the teachers, the first workshop that we had no Mesonet data. So my husband and I had to make up in our minds what we thought Mesonet data might look like so that they had some example maps that we could work with during the Summer Institute. And it was only later that year that the stations started going up and the data started moving through the system, and so there was excitement in the process as we saw more and more stations going up. But we knew that the teachers would be very patient and very forgiving with mistakes that we would make along the way, and we would learn a lot from them about what they needed and how they needed to visualize data. And so they provided us a lot of feedback for our software development and our product development efforts. And at the same time, our colleagues at Oklahoma State University were bringing the data into the agriculture extension community, and another group of patient people who could provide us some feedback. And so it was through those two communities that we kind of got our feet on the ground. We got some grassroots support so that they could talk to their legislators about how valuable of a program this is, and then we were able to develop products a lot better and faster when we all just jumped in together. And we warned them ahead of time. Look, we're just doing this on the fly, and we're learning from ourselves and you and everybody else. And but I think that that's one of the things that made it so successful, because scientists typically go in and they say, okay, this is the way it has to be done, and once we get to that level, then we'll open it up and let everybody use it. And this was a different way of doing things, but most of us were so young we didn't know what the usual way of doing things was. So this to us just seemed like, well, it only makes sense that you would involve your stakeholders, the people who are going to use the data just from day one, and move forward from there. And it was a highly successful model that I've been fortunate to be involved in, because then it just followed me throughout my career, and I've known nothing different other than working with others as projects are developing.
Well, at the end of those 3 years, did the teachers just not still use the data, or you'd already made it aware enough for them to continue to use it, or
yeah?
How did you transition, I guess, is the question.
So we transitioned into well, EarthStorm still exists today. It's just different than it was back then, because obviously the World Wide Web exists now, and teachers now have pressures on them for testing, and so the program has had to evolve over time. But those teachers were able to keep their computers. A lot of them use their experience then and their interactions with us to write their own grants, to bring in. There were teachers who were bringing in full computer classrooms because they were able to write grants, and the local PTA would see what the teachers were able to do in the classroom with the students and said, oh, we need more of this. And so a lot of that happened. These teachers took it to a level that we never really even anticipated when we wrote the grant. And many of them have retired since then, but many of the younger teachers are still out there teaching and out there using Mesonet data on a very regular basis. And they've told their friends, and the data is much more accessible being on the web than it was, and being on cell phones and everything else. And so there's a lot of additional activities that are going on statewide with the teachers that it's just blossomed into a great program.
Seems like that's part of it, is selling the benefits of the Mesonet and what you can do with the data, or garner support financially and other.
Right. I think the biggest, I talk to my colleagues. So I'm a state climatologist of Oklahoma, and once a year all the state climatologists around the country get together, and in many of the state climate offices they do work on their own state observing systems, and so many of them are struggling to get funding to maintain their instrumentation or to build their system to be something that more resembles the Oklahoma Mesonet. And they always come to me and they say, how did you get, so much permanent funding from the state of Oklahoma for the Mesonet? And I think one of the keys was getting these people all throughout the state at the grassroots level, working with the data early on in the process, and contributing to building what is today the Oklahoma Mesonet. And their buy-in and their excitement about it would then be infused to their local legislator, and the other thing I think that was very beneficial is that since it's a partnership between University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University, then when you went in and visited any particular legislator, depending on which of those two universities they graduated with, they could still cheer on the program. And so everybody saw the value. Legislators are very weather aware in Oklahoma. They had people in their district who were users of the data, and very happy users of the data, and so they could easily see the benefits. It became a program that could almost sell itself, and so we benefited from very much from that large group of grassroots supporters.
There's different types of users. Can you talk a little bit about that? There's different. Education's one, but are there others?
Right. So I mentioned real briefly the community and the electric utility industry. So one of the greatest uses of that data in the past 10 years has been looking at our ice storms. So we've had in the 2000s, we had about a dozen ice storms, which we really hadn't seen that number in previous decades, and some of those were just absolutely devastating. And so it was using the Mesonet data and then forecast products from the National Weather Service that we would kind of package together. The electric utility industry was able to see what locations were under the heaviest threat of icing, and how much icing might be occurring. And during an event, strangely enough, our wind sensors, because they're propeller vane anemometers, the little propeller, as it starts getting ice loaded, slows down and it eventually freezes. So you start seeing all the winds decrease on the Mesonet. So you can start measuring very quickly during an ice storm where that icing is starting to occur by just looking at the Mesonet wind products. And so things like that we learned just as things happened, we would then teach the customers, in this case the electric utility industry, and so they would use those tools to start sending out their crews to the region. So for them, it was very cost saving to get their crews to the place where icing was occurring as quickly as possible, because there's two things that hurt their industry. One is the amount of personnel time to recover from an ice storm, and so you have to bring in crews as quickly as possible, because if it's harder to get in, or if they have to bring them in from Arkansas or other states, then that's a longer period of time that they don't have those poles up, and it's more dangerous for the people who they have trying to fix things, because they have to work longer hours. But also they're losing money when those poles are down and there's no electricity running through them. So it costs them in two ways. And for the rural electric utility industry in particular, they're out in very rural areas of the state, and there's a lot of poles that tend to be affected in these events. And so the products that we would provide would help them better stage their response and get things back up and running faster. Then in the summertime, they would, the amount of electricity that they could push through one of these large power lines was very much related to the temperature and then the dissipation of the heat around the line. So if the winds were calm and it was very hot out, they couldn't push as much electricity through the line as they could if they had some winds, some crosswind that would help cool that line. And so they would use our data to help them know how much electricity they could push through a line. They would also use our data to get a better idea of on the generation side. So Western Farmers Electric Cooperative also generates electricity down in Anadarko, and they would use it because they're distributing that energy across the state to multiple electric cooperatives. And so they would be able to see if temperatures were cooling off in a part of the state, so they knew that demand was going to go down, so they might know, oh, I don't have to turn on another generator, which might cost $50,000, or I don't remember how much, but a large chunk of money to start up a new generator. And they could use the data to kind of gauge whether there was going to be a demand for that electricity and they needed to start it up, or if an area of the state might be cooling off because of cloud cover and that demand was going to go down. So they were one of our major users. Obviously the emergency management community, in addition to the Mesonet data, by 1996 we started providing radar data, and it was unique for an emergency management community statewide to have access to radar data. So it's not like today where all the radar data is available on the World Wide Web. At that time, the National Weather Service had contracted with 4 private companies to distribute radar data. And so those companies had a price on the data that they distributed, and a large city like Oklahoma City could afford that price, which and private companies and large government entities could afford the price, the monthly data price. But the city of Moore, Oklahoma, Prague, these towns didn't have that kind of budget, so they had no access to live radar data. So we worked a deal with one of the distributors that we at the Oklahoma Climate Survey would pay a fixed price and be able to redistribute that radar data to all emergency managers who attended our workshops and learned about how to use radar data in the OK First program. And so that was, as far as we know, first of a kind in the country to be able to do that and do that redistribution. So we were able to get that radar data in tandem with our Oklahoma Mesonet data out to the rural parts of Oklahoma, starting in 1996, and this became very, very important on May 3rd of 1999 when we had a major tornado outbreak and flash flood event into May 4th. That tornado outbreak was devastating for the city of Moore, but the emergency manager there, Galen Kitch, had gone through our workshop. He was actually in the first class of our workshop, so he had been using all of the data that we provided for years, and so he could make his community as safe as humanly possible in that type of event. But in the other rural areas, typically what would happen without access to weather data on their computers, which we were able to provide, without that access, what they would do is they'd turn on whatever TV station they could get on the air, and then hope that somewhere in the weather programming they would show for a period of time something that was over their area, where the storms were coming nearby. And they had access to, they could talk on ham radio to the National Weather Service offices, so they weren't without any type of communications at that time. But as the Moore event occurred and it turned into a disaster event as opposed to a weather event, the local TV stations were focused on the damages in Moore. And every now and then they would update people on the storms that were still occurring across the state, but it wasn't as live as it had been before the damages occurred. And so these rural emergency managers, now they had access to live Mesonet data and live radar data at their location, and we provided them the visualization software so that they could see this. So they had decision tools that they had really never had before. And there were multiple very violent tornadoes that happened after the F5 tornado that went through Moore. And there was a lot of flash flooding in northeast Oklahoma at that time, and many of these tornadoes were now going through at night. And the decisions that those emergency managers who had gone through the OK First program were making at the local level to stop traffic on highways and other local decisions saved so many lives that year. And it was through their stories and the stories of teachers and others that really led to the full funding of the Oklahoma Mesonet the following year. And so we always believe that if you put the data in the hands of the people who can make the decisions, as opposed to trying to do that from above, but give it to the local people so that they can make those decisions, that it'll benefit the state substantially more than if any of us tried to go make those decisions ourselves. some of the data has been used in very unusual circumstances. We had a homicide that was solved because of Oklahoma Mesonet data. I don't remember all of the details of the case, but apparently the perpetrator of the crime indicated that he was out in a certain area, and his I guess his shoes were wet or something like that, and he indicated that it hadn't been raining, and our data was able to prove that it was. And there had actually been a number of police cases that have been solved with our data used as backup. Of course, the agricultural community is a huge user of our data and products, and our colleagues at Oklahoma State have developed a lot of products that have benefited specific agricultural producers, whether it be pecans or watermelons or wheat or whatever that crop is. These crops are very much sensitive to changes in the weather and the amount of precipitation, and so there have been a number of models that have been developed that kind of go right to the heart of decisions that agricultural producers have to make. We've also led by Oklahoma State. We've worked with fire managers across the state, so fire conditions very much weather dependent, and another case where we brought multiple sources of data together. So we actually use satellite observations in concert with Oklahoma Mesonet data to build models of how dangerous it might be, what the fire conditions could be like, and if a fire were ignited, how fast it might move, and how hot it might be. And a lot of these fire managers just rely day by day on those products. And a lot of those resulted from an incident. It was in the early 90s. Actually, it was before the it was after the Mesonet was funded, but before the Mesonet sites went online. There was somebody was doing a prescribed burn east of Enid, and it was north of a major highway, and at the time the winds were coming from the south, and they were doing a prescribed burn, but there was a wind shift that the National Weather Service weather network at that time, which they didn't have a lot of stations in Oklahoma. That network couldn't measure the wind shift, and it shifted. The fire then burned back to the south after the winds shifted from the north, and burnt out a hay barn, and all of the smoke from that hay then went over the road, and there was a multiple car accident, and I think 2 fatalities from that. Whereas if we had the Oklahoma Mesonet at that time, if we had the high resolution spatial data, we would have been able to detect that wind shift, and fire officials would not have allowed the prescribed burn to occur. And there have been a number of fire officials who have said that one of the things they do watch when they are working wildfires is where the wind shifts are, and then they'll redeploy their units ahead of the wind shift so that they're in the right position, such that when the wind shifts, they've kept their personnel safe, and they're in the right position to better fight the fire. And certainly the research community not only weather research and climate research, but agricultural engineering and civil engineering and hydrology, and just a wide variety of research communities use the Oklahoma Mesonet data for their research projects. Because we've had the Oklahoma Mesonet, we've been able to bring in multiple national and international field projects to the state of Oklahoma that we wouldn't have had an opportunity to bring in before, because nobody else has as dense of a network as we have, and so it provides a set of data that is very hard to match anywhere else. And so we've been involved in all kinds of field campaigns that have come in and investigated some sort of phenomenon for a period of time, whether it be 6 weeks or a full year. The data have been used to help validate satellite observations. So satellites out there trying to measure different types of variables like soil moisture from space. And so having a soil moisture network like we have with the Oklahoma Mesonet allows them to compare directly to observations. I would say that we established the Oklahoma Mesonet as a multi-purpose network, and that was part of the focus of developing it, so that it wouldn't be just an ag network or a weather forecasting network or some more narrow focus. We knew we wanted to develop it to be multi-purpose, but we really had no clue on all of the things it really could be used for until we were well into it.
Sure, not with a detective case.
No.
Did the steering committee have much input in all of this, or just as they came
into the development of the network itself?
Well, various uses for it.
So the steering committee certainly had certain audiences that they wanted, with the ag audience being one of the main focuses. But most of these kind of outreach activities were not officially part of the Oklahoma Mesonet at that time. The Mesonet was really focused on building a network with high quality data and being able to provide products that people could use easily. But most of these other education programs that would then bring in users to a class and learn about how to use the data, those were funded separately from the Mesonet and were either part of our outreach activities at the Oklahoma Climate Survey. So like EarthStorm project was funded through the National Science Foundation and through the Department of Energy. And the OK First project was funded through the Department of Commerce. The rural electric cooperatives themselves through the Oklahoma Association for Electric Cooperatives provided funding for their folks to go and learn about the Mesonet. And so these were very, very related activities, but we looked at other sources of funding to provide that.
It's been a long 20 years and a short 20 years, I guess.
Yes.
Were you involved when it got approval from the legislature to fund it, when Governor Bellman said what to go?
Yes, in fact, the funding it was initiated in the Senate Appropriations Committee, Education Appropriations Committee, that was chaired at that time by Senator Cal Hobson of the Norman area. And so Senator Hobson had been a staunch supporter for years, as were many other legislators. And I and Ken Crawford and Ron Elliott went to present to the Appropriations Subcommittee about funding the Oklahoma Mesonet. And so I remember pretty clearly that that meeting that they had where the funding was initiated. And so as a group of scientists, the most typical thing is you go up there and you start bringing all of your bells and whistles and charts and talk science language, but we just kind of introduced ourselves, and then we stepped back and we brought three of the users with us. And for the bulk of the time that we were provided, which was about a half hour in front of the committee, the bulk of the time was spent by those three users talking about how they used Oklahoma Mesonet data and the differences that it made in their lives. And we had one teacher, one emergency manager, and a line manager from an electric cooperative who spoke. And the teacher made almost every legislator in the room cry because of the stories that she would talk about in terms of some of the students who had come into her classroom who had learning disabilities or had kind of emotional problems and had hard times engaging with their peers. And she would put those people in charge of working with the Oklahoma Mesonet data and teaching the other students how to use it. And so they became kind of the local hero in the classroom. And so she told a story of a particular student who had gone through that program and continued to come back year in and year out to the classroom after school and continue to work with the data. And then he had just recently gotten his ACT score back, and it was outstanding, and he was going to go on to college. And just success stories like that kind of sold it to the committee. And so they put in full funding for everything that we had asked for. They fully supported, and it went through the House committee and the governor's office. Governor Bellman had always been a fantastic supporter of the Mesonet. He had a site near his where his farm was in Red Rock, Oklahoma, and being from a farm background, he understood very clearly how important having weather data was to the farmers of the state. And at that time, many of the leaders in the legislature were from the rural parts of the state and were very agricultural focused. And so it was very clear to them what the benefits were. And so we had no opposition that we knew of as things progressed, other than, obviously state budgets are tight, but it was a team effort, I would say, and a big part of the team was the people who were using the data.
Pretty good tactic.
So, and we still today have a lot of supporters in the legislature, and even at the congressional level. Congressman Lucas checks Mesonet data on a daily basis while he's in D.C. so that he knows what's going on back in western Oklahoma. A number of the legislators, especially these past couple of years, have been very concerned about the drought conditions in the Mesonet. Mesonet data have been crucial to better defining where the droughts, either better or worse across the state of Oklahoma. So every week there's a couple of climatologists at the Climate Survey who provide input to the National Drought Monitor on where all of those lines are drawn on the weekly drought maps. And those lines make a lot of difference, because if you get in a certain category of drought, all of a sudden federal assistance is available to the agricultural community. So if you don't have knowledge of how bad it is because you don't have a Mesonet like we have with soil moisture sensors and, at multiple levels, then you might be missing out on federal assistance to citizens of your state because you just don't have any proof that it's as bad as it is.
Is there a state that has something similar?
So there are a number of states that have networks that are like ours in many respects. The things that are most different are that they don't have as high spatial resolution, so they have fewer stations for the size of an area that they're in. But Kentucky has a very good network. Georgia used to have one, but it wasn't, the funding wasn't continued. Iowa and Illinois has had a network for even longer than the Oklahoma Mesonet. Again, it just doesn't have as many stations for the area. So there's a lot of states that are out there. It used to be that we would, at least a couple times a year, there would be a different group that would come in and meet with us about how we set up the Mesonet and what we did and how we made decisions and how we got funding and all of the how-to questions, so that they could try to go and emulate that somewhere else. Probably the place that emulated it the most closely is out of Texas Tech University. So the West Texas Mesonet has developed, and in fact they brought some of our employees, Mesonet employees, down when they were first setting it up to show how to do maintenance to a station and how to install a station and all of those things. But we've had people from different countries come. The province of Quebec in Canada still works directly with the Oklahoma Mesonet on mostly on the software development side, providing products and services and to their largely agricultural based and fire managers in the province of Quebec. But we've worked with numerous either states or countries across the world to talk about the process that we went through. And in some cases they can emulate it, and in some cases it's hard to emulate. But I think that there's a lot of networks that are out there and are in better condition than they were as a result of the work here.
As you look forward, do you have any vision for the next 20 years?
Well, so we've been around for 20 years, and that starts to make a good basis for a solid climate record. And there's a lot of our customers across the state who are asking about changes in climate and variations in the climate and how to build more resilient communities or build infrastructure that will last through some of the really intense rainfall events we've now been measuring. And so I think one of our one of our key visions is to see the development of the network in a way that helps provide people some better information about how they can be more resistant to drought, resistant to changes in climate, changes in the environment that they're around. I would certainly see Mesonet data becoming more mobile than it is today, and products and services, and on smartphones and iPads and all of that to become essentially ingrained in how people interact. But I would also hope that the private sector community would take advantage of the data that's available in the Oklahoma Mesonet to try out new things that they may not have thought of before, or may have thought of and didn't have the data to test it out. I think Oklahoma's a perfect place to do some really innovative product development because of the data that we have here. So, you could imagine that you're driving down an interstate and maybe there's some weather hazard that's ahead of you, and you've got intense rainfall that's been measured by the Oklahoma Mesonet, and your car alerts you and tells you where to pull off, and here, stop at this restaurant and have a meal and wait 2 hours until it's safe to go on. And so I just think that there's a lot of things that could be done with the data that aren't being done, because it really does rely on the private sector community to kind of get fully engaged with the data that are available. And I think for the science community, so one of the things that was just recently announced by the National Science Foundation is I and a colleague of mine, Duncan Wilson at Oklahoma State University, have been helping a broad group of social scientists, ecosystem scientists, and physical scientists to lead an effort to develop what's called couple human and natural systems. So let's couple the data that we get from the Oklahoma Mesonet and from satellite observations and radar observations and other of these physical systems to social science data. So measurements of people's attitudes and perceptions and behaviors, and so there's a $20 million National Science Foundation project that's just been funded for the state of Oklahoma, Oklahoma State University, University of Oklahoma, Sam Noble Research Foundation, and Tulsa University, all involved in that, as well as all of the tribal colleges across Oklahoma. And it's to look at adapting socio-ecological systems to climate variability. And the idea is that people make decisions on how they use water, how they respond to severe weather events, and just all kinds of decisions related to weather and climate and their environment as events occur. And so if we can measure people's perceptions and attitudes and the decisions that they're making on how they're using resources, or whether they respond to a tornado by sheltering or by fleeing on the interstate, we can link that to the physical data to know what actually happened in that location and how these decisions are being directly influenced by what they experienced in the environment. And so we'll be building kind of the social science equivalent of the Oklahoma Mesonet over the next 5 years. And and have a survey system where on a quarterly basis we'll be able to ask these types of questions across the state of Oklahoma, but do it in a way where it's what they call geo-referenced, or it's we won't know exactly what household per se the respondent is in, but we'll know in general the area, the region that they're in, and where their closest Mesonet site is. So as they, for example, we've gone through these 2 years of severe drought in the state, and so had we had that system in at that time, we could have seen the evolution of how people made changes in how they used water based on how drought conditions progressed, or maybe they had a couple of weeks of rainfall and then they changed their water decisions in a different way. And so it will help us understand that linkage between what's happening in the physical environment and decisions that people are making, so that we can hopefully better use the resources that we have in the state, and then if conservation methods are needed because of drought conditions in a certain region, we have a way to communicate that need, because we understand better. Well, I don't, but the social scientists know how to do that work to better understand what type of messaging needs to be made, so that people realize maybe the dire conditions that are occurring. And so and I think that project in itself, it'll be again, this social science network observatory across the state of Oklahoma will be one of a kind. It'll be world unique, like the Oklahoma Mesonet was world unique, and the hope is that will again bring in more research into the state, more funding opportunities for our research community, and better products and services to people in Oklahoma, because we'll better understand what decisions they want products and services for, and how they're interpreting the products and services that we're providing, such that we can tune them to better serve their needs. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity.
I'll have to come back in 5 years and see how it went.
Yes.
You'll have to find an angle for K-12 for that particular project.
Yeah, so this has been funded under what's called the UpScore program, experimental program to stimulate competitive research. So the National Science Foundation has money that's set aside for certain states that traditionally don't get as much National Science Foundation funding as other states. So there's a swath of states, for example, in the Great Plains, excluding Texas, that traditionally doesn't get as much funding. There's Idaho and New Mexico and Delaware, some of these other states that traditionally don't get as much funding, and so they have access to this funding provided through the UpScore program. And the 5-year program that the state of Oklahoma just won, the $20 million, 60% of that is for research, and then the other 40% is for education and workforce development and diversity initiatives. And so part of that funding will go into better education in our K through 12 schools, for our science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or what's called STEM education. Provide opportunities for the K through 12 students. It'll provide opportunities for students in the tribal colleges in Oklahoma, actually providing resources for them to build parts of their science curriculum better, including actual people to teach that, as well as equipment that might go into classroom based on the needs of that college, and work on a number of diversity initiatives to broaden the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. So bringing more women and minorities into those fields. And so I think it'll be a pretty exciting program because so many people in Oklahoma are interested in weather and climate, that I think that for this 5-year project that I'll kind of infuse some excitement into that. Not saying that the previous one was on bioengineering or bioenergy, and not saying that isn't exciting, but I think the people in the state are just naturally tuned to what's going on in the weather and climate, that I think it provides a lot of opportunities for people to get excited about science.
Seems like it's been a very good fit for you to come to
It
Oklahoma.
has. So I've been very honored to work with the Mesonet and their team, and I think more than anything, just the process from starting from scratch and then seeing it in fruition has been, for me, career-wise, just outstanding, because it gave me confidence to start some very major programs from scratch, and not necessarily knowing where they're going or what they might end up being in 10 or 20 years, but knowing that if you work with the people who are going to use the products and services, that it'll evolve in a direction that will be of more benefit than you can actually imagine in your own little mind. So I'm excited about some of that too.